How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
Welcome back to my conversation with Stephan Wiedner, psychological safety expert and the co-founder and CEO of Numi and Zarango. In the previous episode, Stephan gave us working definitions of psychological safety, and he also explained how he got into this field in the first place. We also talked about what a psychologically safe work environment really looks like, and how we teach the unique skills that can bring it about. In this second part, he and I get into a lot more specific connections between psychological safety and culture building, and we start by specifically looking into the leadership side of things. So let's go back in a more broad context. And so we know that having an environment that's psychologically safe is really important. And we know that you've developed, and then there are methods of not only teaching and practicing these skills, and I appreciate your emphasis on the practice part of that, because learning it once isn't going to do it. We got to practice, as you've said. And you've developed ways of measuring that. So if you're talking to a leader, so we work with companies all over the world, and we're teaching them how to build really high-performing cultures in their companies. If you were teaching somebody, so how do we build a culture that creates psychological safety? What are the keys to being able to do that as a culture?
Yeah, well, I think you probably have a better answer to that question than me, because I think your work really looks at the broader range of the organization. I would answer it like this. If you consider an organization, especially a larger one with hundreds or thousands, tens of thousands of employees, you can think of the culture as a weather map. So, on the morning news, when someone's telling you, all right, we got some flurries coming in today and it's sunny over here in the Northwest, etc. That is your weather system. And a weather system is hard to change, right? Just like culture. Culture is hard to change. So it's this large amorphous thing. And yet we know it affects everyone. It affects everything, right? It's ever present. And it's hard to change. And so if you consider that weather map, there's going to be hot spots and cold spots. And I think of psychological safety as the local temperature. It's what's happening in the team, because psychological safety is a team-based construct. It's very contextually dependent. So how you feel in terms of psychological safety depends on the environment that you're in, because you might be a manager of a team, and in that team, you feel great. I could say what I want and need. And I think I foster a great environment with my team as well. Whereas move up, let's say you're also part of a senior executive team or a management team. Suddenly within that environment, you might not quite feel the same levels of psychological safety. That's very common. We see that a lot with managers that are managing their own team, but then also have to sit as a peer in a group with their peers. And so it is contextually dependent. You can measure psychological safety for every team. You can measure it for a department. You can measure it for, a business unit. And so if you map, let's say marketing team is over here in California and the legal department's over there in Florida, you could imagine, visualize these hot and cold spots across the country, right? Or across your organization. And so with that metaphor in mind, I would say where we go to work is trying to affect the team at the team level by teaching those skills to the manager, to the team members, so that that team can boost its overall sense of psychological safety through the skill development.
Got it.
And so then if you help one team, you can help many teams, right? You can scale it out.
So it's more granular.
Yeah, it's a little bit more granular. And I love the way you look at culture and look at the norms and try to instill in folks these broader kind of higher level norms around. Remind me, one of them was something like
practice blameless problem solving.
There you go. Practice blameless problem solving. I think that's a wonderful norm. I have a better word for it. You're deliberately creating norms. And we've seen that with psychological safety. I think we all have that experience of joining a new team. And it's like we have these social antenna up going, how do we do things around here? If I have a problem, who do I talk to, right? We are trying to sense for the norms. Yeah, what's okay? How do we operate? How do we carry ourselves in this work environment, right? Yeah. Those are norms. And if you don't explicitly develop and create those norms, they're just going to happen, right? Yep. Humans look for that certainty. They look for that reassurance. And so I do believe that what the work you're doing really enforces that. It's sort of one level up from those interpersonal skills, because even if you have great interpersonal skills, if you're working in an environment where there's certain norms, those norms are going to override your skills.
Yeah. We call those, just my own language for them, we call those norms fundamentals, that when an organization purposely defines what are those norms, what are those fundamental behaviors, that this is how we want to operate here. Now, this is what it's going to be, so that when those new people come in, they're not trying to guess at, well, what is the norm here? No, this is how we operate. This is the language we use. This is the way we talk about it. This is what we practice, so that we create that environment. Now, to your point, underneath that, to the extent you're developing people's skill set so they get better at it, now we've done something even more powerful. So tell me more about the measurement part of this. So how do you measure this?
Yeah, so one of the tools that we're using for measurement is a tool that we've developed called FISM. So we're drawing on research that's been done in counseling. And in the world of counseling, they've identified, or researchers have asked the question, what makes a great counselor? And the obvious answer is the ones that get better outcomes for their clients consistently over time. And so they've looked at the data, and then they've asked themselves, okay, well, what characterizes the best therapists, the best counselors, the ones that get the best outcomes year after year after year? And what they've developed is sometimes what they might call common factors, or in the case of Ohio State University, Tim Anderson, he developed what they call the facilitative interpersonal skills. It's basically an inventory of skills that are observable, and they can measure these skills by exposing individuals to challenging moments in a counseling situation. And they say, okay, here's a challenging moment. How might you respond? And the individual responds, they record that, and then they codify it. They have human coders who are trained to look for certain behaviors, and they assess them. And so what we've done is we've taken that instrument and we've modified it ever so slightly. It really hasn't been modified tremendously for managers. Because when we looked at the inventory of skills, gosh, they're all the same. There's 8 of them that we can identify, that are observable, and they can be measured. And there's, number 1 is verbal flow. Verbal flow is essentially how you speak, right? The words that are coming out of your mouth, not the words, but how those words are communicated. Are there a lot of ums and ahs and pauses? And what that is doing is it's a measuring how much anxiety you have. So in a particularly challenging moment, right? If you're nervous, your verbal flow is going to go down. So that's one thing we measure. We measure hope and positive expectation, the ability to generate hope and positive expectation in others. The third is persuasiveness. How persuasive are you? How skilled are you at being able to bring someone and have someone accept a view that's different from their own? The fourth is emotional expression. So this is the nonverbals. It's what's happening with your face and your hands and your tone. Fifth is acceptance. So it's how non-judgmental are you? So it's not that you have to agree with other people. It's just, is there room, and do you create space for others to offer different opinions? Empathy, I think, is fairly well understood by folks. I think a lot of people feel like they have a lot of empathy. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for the observable aspect of it. So do you communicate it? Do you communicate that I get and I can understand and appreciate your point of view or your experience? Seventh is alliance capacity. So this is basically collaborativeness, or what we'll use we language. Like, do you speak about me and you, or do you talk about us? And then the last one is interpersonal responsiveness. So this is the degree to which you approach those ruptures, those difficult moments, right? So if you're going, oh, this is really makes me nervous, could we just have one-on-ones? I'll talk to you all individually. Versus, this is really challenging. Let's talk about this, folks. That's a much more interpersonally responsive
Interesting.
Strategy. Yeah. So those are the 8. And again, like I said, we can assess those. So we have coders who are trained to observe these skills, provides codes, scores, and those scores are between a 1 and a 5, but they're on like 0.25 increments. So it's basically a 20-point scale where, right in the middle, a 10 would be, or 10 out of 20, or a 3 out of 5 is neutral, 5 being a positive display of these skills, and a 1 being a negative or harmful or a poorly. It's not just that the skills are used poorly, it's that they're actually harmful or perceived as such, right? So it is an impressionistic assessment. So it is scientific, it's evidence-based, but it's not like...
It's still subjective to some extent.
To some extent, right? And what it's been rigorously tested so that there is inter-rater reliability. So you can have multiple raters. If they're all trained in the same thing, you'll get a score that's within a small, rather small standard deviation.
Right.
Yeah.
And so each at certain intervals, then you're doing this training, and at certain intervals, then you're giving people scores for how they're doing, and are people improving in these skills?
Yeah, exactly. So we can measure before and after. Now, there's a much more simple strategy that we often use, which is we give people clips at the beginning to respond to, and then we give them clips at the end. And we just say, just observe how you've done. Take a look at the first ones and then take a look at the last ones. And generally, that is enough for them to go, holy moly, have I ever improved? Because I think a lot of it is a lot of people are competent interpersonally, right? They're good. They're naturally good for whatever reason. They have skills. And yet there's this unconscious competence. And so the training, what it generally does is it has people become a lot more conscious so that they can use and really leverage the skills deliberately when they need to. And so at the end, they can see, oh, wow, look what I'm doing. This is really awesome. And for those who've actually really improved their skills a lot, it's palpable. It's noticeable. You don't need an assessment. You just look at it yourself. It's kind of like the before and after. Like I don't when you're losing weight, like I honestly don't need the scale. I've got a mirror and that's sufficient.
Right. And I gotta believe that people that go through this training you're describing, not only are they more effective at work, it has to affect their personal lives. You can't work on this
100%.
stuff without being a better husband, father, son, daughter, wife, whatever.
100%. And I think that's where it really hits home for folks, because everybody wants to improve their relationship with their kids, with their mom, their spouse. Who doesn't, right? And so if you suddenly have the skills to be able to communicate better with the people around you, the ones that you love and care about the most, that's just icing on the cake.
Yeah. So when you just to step back much more broadly than we've been, when you look at organizations' desire to create an environment that is more psychologically safe, do you see in your experience so far, I'm just curious about this, are there certain kinds of leaders that tend to be more interested in that, or certain kinds of industries or certain age groups that, segments of the population that, you know what, when I see people in that, they're all over this. And when I see people in those industries or those age groups or these demographics, I don't even waste my breath because they're not interested in this. What have you found about that?
Well, I've talked to a lot of people. I haven't talked to everyone. So I want to be careful about making any sort of broad generalizations.
Your observations so far.
Yeah, everything needs to be taken with a grain of salt, obviously. Sure. One thing that I found really interesting is you could say that there's like progressive industries like tech, right, where they're at the front end of a lot of discussions around culture and how to do, how to create good environments for your workers and so on. And then maybe more laggard type industries that are like industrial,
right,
And what I found really interesting, one of the really interesting insights I've seen is the desire for psychological safety in those industrial environments. And the connection that's been made there is there's a connection between psychological safety and
physical safety, I'll bet.
Physical safety or life and death situations, right? And because working with learning and development folks in an industrial environment, a really bad day for them is one where someone dies.
Yeah.
And when someone dies, the questions start being asked, like, why? How did this happen? First of all, obviously,
who didn't speak up and why?
Why did it happen? What was was it preventable? Was there, did we foresee this potential risk? What was the plan to mitigate the risk? Did the plan get executed properly? All of these questions really hinge on psychological safety. They hinge on people saying, you know what, this doesn't seem safe to me. I need to speak up. I need to say something and address it head on. And so that to me has been really, really fascinating to see that kind of evolution and that connection between, this soft skills and, psychological safety, kind of this high level concept in life and death situations.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. To your comment, I think we work with a lot of manufacturing and industrial companies. They are, for the most part, very serious about safety. Safety is something at the top of their list. And sometimes it's OSHA required in the US. But even if it's not, they mean it. It matters to them that their people go home safe. And I could certainly understand, to your point, how creating an environment where it's psychological. We say one of the fundamentals in most of those companies, we have one that we often call what's the word I like to use? I'm trying to think of the word I use. It's not be rigorous about safety. Be vigilant about safety is the word I use. And we teach them, as part of being vigilant about safety, that safety is everybody's responsibility, and it's not just your safety, but it's the safety of your teammates as well. That you see something going on that doesn't look safe, you have a responsibility to speak up on behalf of your teammates. To your point, you can't do that if you don't have psychological safety. If it's not a safe environment, if you're going to feel embarrassed, or your peer group is going to ostracize you because you spoke up because Stephan wasn't wearing his hard hat, and I'm going to feel embarrassed if I say something, that's not going to be a safe environment. It's got to be psychologically safe for me to speak up and advocate on behalf of the safety of my teammates. So I can see what you're saying.
And I know from a personal point of view, again, coming back to firefighting, a really big pull for individuals is to not demonstrate weakness, right? Like if someone says, quick, do this, and you're not trained in it, and you don't know how to do it, you don't know how to use, let's say it's a car accident, we're using these really powerful tools to, the jaws of life to open up doors and so on. If you're not trained, you have a responsibility to say, I can't do this. But in that moment, it might be a life and death situation. There's someone there, the pull to just say, okay, right, is really challenging. And so being able to ask for that help, or I know, like being put on the lead on a medical call, right? And you suddenly in this environment and you're starting to feel overwhelmed. Oh my goodness, this is a life or death situation. And you start climbing up. You need to be able to turn to your partner and say, I need help. Like, keep me focused here, tap me on the shoulder, whatever, something. And that's not easy to do. It's not easy to ask for help in those situations, or admit that, I don't feel confident using this tool or doing this thing. So all of that is part of psychological safety. Yeah.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, Stephan. So as we wrap up, 2 questions for you. One, so as my listeners think about our conversation together, what would be the most important thing you want people to remember from this conversation? What should they take away about the importance of psychological safety, or what they should be doing about it?
Yeah. The first thing I would say is perhaps it's not about psychological safety. Okay. Instead, it's about that practice piece, which is, you can't learn to play the piano by reading a book. We know that. We appreciate that. And so interpersonal skills, communication skills, which, as you well pointed out, is at the root of most problems in business, those skills can be learned. And it's not always comfortable.
To be practiced.
They have to be practiced, right? To learn them, you need to practice. You need to engage in practice, deliberate, effortful practice. So that's the first thing I would say.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And if there's a second, can I offer a second thing?
Go for a second.
The second I would say is regarding psychological safety. And, I talked about those social antenna that we have, right? Now that you're familiar with the concept, I've given you a definition, the courage to speak up, the confidence to know you'll be heard. The first thing I'd invite you to do is just pay attention. Don't do anything differently except in a team environment, pay attention to others and how and why they might be refraining from speaking up. What are the conditions that are causing people to maybe just hold back a little bit? And again, it's probably not, they're not malicious. It's not that they're trying to withhold information. They're just not necessarily feeling free to do so. And also noticing yourself. Notice the conversations, the topics that cause you to feel anxious inside, right? So maybe it's about talking about compensation or talking about that client you just lost or whatever that thing is. What causes you to kind of go, and not divulge to the people around you? And that's it. Just notice. Just put those antenna up.
One of the, can't help but add in this comment. One of the things I remember reading, I'm trying to think of who the author was that talked about this. It might have been Patrick Lencioni, talked about the concept of mining for conflict. Have you heard of that concept? It's his way of describing, you're in a meeting and I'm the leader. And I ask, so is everybody good with what we're saying? And nobody says anything. But I can see in your body language that you look like you're not so sure you're in agreement. So his phrase, I think it was Lencioni, his phrase for mining for conflict is looking for, wait a second, Stephan, you don't look like you look like there's something going on here. So I ask you, so tell me more. You look, concerned. And now you speak up. One of the things that's most important for me to do, and it goes with what you were just saying, is, one, acknowledge, well, thank you for saying something about that. But let me ask you, what kept you from saying that? So why did I have to pull that out of you? Was I doing something? Maybe I was doing something that was creating an environment that you didn't feel safe. Or maybe it's something on you. But I want to acknowledge, I appreciate you showing the courage to speak up in that moment. But I also want to make sure we're doing that all the time. Help me understand what kept you from doing that. And just having that kind of a conversation raises that level of awareness that you're describing. That can be very powerful.
Yeah, great suggestion. I love that. That's a really good point, right? And we often talk about sort of this oppositional point of view. Like if everyone's in agreement, oh yeah, this sounds awesome. I think sometimes it's great, even if you're not seeing the body language, to go, all right, folks, let's all put our black hat on here. Why is this the worst idea ever? Why? Give me 10 reasons why we shouldn't do this. Because, let's start mining for the oppositional points of view and let's bring those into the room intentionally.
Yeah. And there again, if I were doing that, I would then after that ask, so why did I have to pull that out of you? So you were thinking that, why was that not coming up? Because we got to get to the heart of that too for the future.
That's right.
Which is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I like pointing it back to the fundamental you mentioned, right? So, okay, folks, we want to get to the root of that because we have a fundamental, fill in the blank, whatever kind of matches. So like to have rigorous conversations about all different points of view or, I'm assuming you could define whatever fundamental you want, whatever works, whatever language works for your organization.
Yeah, and there are ones, as you might guess, that are pretty common across lots of organizations. I mentioned practice blameless problem solving as an example is one that's just so critical to every organization. But yeah, each one has its own, but there's a lot of commonality, not surprisingly. All right, last question for you. So people want to, our audience may want to learn a lot more about the tools you use, you offer, and the skills that you provide. Where do they find you?
Yeah, well, what I'd like to offer, David, if you're okay with it, I'd love to offer all your listeners a free psychological safety assessment. So
Great.
it's a simple tool that we can use to administer the psychological safety measure of your team. And so if that's of interest to you, the web address is Zarango, zarango.com/free PSI. So free PSI. PSI stands for Psychological Safety Index. So if you check that page out, there's a little form. You can put in your name and we'll get back to you and we'll happily administer that assessment for you and your team and even debrief the results so that you have something tangible that you can walk away with and start to generate some dialogue within your team.
That's great. I really appreciate that. We'll put that in the show notes as well. So anybody listening to this, you can see it right on our website on the show notes. Stephan, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation. I appreciate your contributions to the culture community.
David, it was a pleasure and an honor. Thank you for having me.
And that's it for today's episode of Culture Architects with Stephan Wiedner, psychological safety expert and co-founder and CEO of both Numi and Zarango. Folks, if you're enjoying the show, make sure you take a second to subscribe, and that way you automatically get my new episodes as soon as they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I'd love it if you left us a review, and that way more culture enthusiasts like yourself can discover the show. I'll see you next time.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.